So, hello everyone, welcome back to this channel. So in this video, we are going to learn about what exactly is an interrupt and what is its function. So if you were to look at the definition, an interrupt is where a signal that is sent from a device or a program to the OS that causes a temporary stop, which does what its name implies, interrupt the OS from doing something. And some examples of interrupt is that when you try to create two folders with the same name, or when you try to perform a 5 divided by 0 in your calculator, something will happen. And other examples could be from a hardware fault, in which when the printer is out of ink, paper is jammed, a timing signal, or even the software errors. So the function of all this interrupt is to cause the current program to temporarily stop what it is doing so that the OS can service the interrupt. It's like a signal to the OS to tell him, hey, I have a problem here, please help me to solve it. So for instance, let's say if your printer is out of paper, the computer will need to know to inform the user, in which this box will come up, which is a case of how interrupts is functioning, in which it tells that it sends an interrupt, that your printer sends an interrupt to your OS to show the user this message so that they can refill the paper or refill the ink. Alright, so these are some of the examples of an interrupt. So let's look at how the interrupt is handled, the flow of how it's handled. So first of all, the device, it will send an interrupt signal. It could also be a software. And for instance, if these things happen, the device or the software will send an interrupt signal. And this interrupt signal is collected by something called the interrupt handlers. So before we talk about the next step, let's just look at our von Neumann architecture. So as mentioned in the hardware video, when a code needs to be executed, the code needs to be moved from the secondary storage into the memory unit so that the CPU can process it. But if you think about it, if there are so many instructions that needs to be executed in 1 second, how does the computer decide which instruction to execute first? And this is where we listen to the interrupt service routine, in which just now we say that the interrupt is being collected by an interrupt handlers. So based on how important the interrupt is, it will be assigned a priority and therefore placed in a queue. Alright? It can be before the next task executed, or it could also be after each task is executed. And upon completing a fetch, decode, execute cycle, the CPU will check the priority of the next interrupt to see if it has a higher priority than the current task being processed. Remember, if your computer, let's say, have a 3 GHz CPU, this means that they can execute 3 billion instructions at the same time. But then the CPU needs to know which instruction needs to be executed first. Therefore, this is when the priority comes into play. So here they said if the interrupt that is being sent to the CPU has a higher priority than the current task being executed, then the CPU will stop what it is doing and fetches the interrupt to the CPU to be processed. However, if it has a lower priority, if the interrupt has a lower priority than the current task, it will leave the interrupt in the interrupt queue, okay, and carries on processing. So, in fact, this process happens so quickly. As I said, a computer can process billions of instructions in 1 second. Therefore, this process happens so quickly that it is impossible for the user to notice that the OS has been interrupted. And this interrupts, the function of it is that they allow computers to carry out many tasks at the same time, which means the interrupt can be sent at any time. It doesn't need to be executed first, but if it has a higher priority, then it will be executed. And for interrupt, you also need to know how to differentiate between software interrupt. For instance, when division of 0 and try to process attempt to access the same memory location, which means that if there's an information here and you try to use this location to store another character, another data, then they will show you a software interrupt. whereas the hardware interrupts could be the press of a key on the keyboard or even the click of the mouse button. So first of all, we learned that interrupt is a signal sent by device and programmed to the OS to cause a temporary stop. And the reason this interrupt is needed is so that the computers can run multiple tasks at the same time instead of being one after the other. And the two types of interrupt there are is, first of all, the software interrupt and also the hardware interrupt. And that's the end of this video. And in the next video, we are going to learn the different types of programming language available. I'll see you then. Goodbye.